Anyway, here we are, the third interview. We just finished with Sean Gordon Murphy, comics writer and illustrator, and we're moving into a game section, which I'm super excited about. I've been in the games industry for a few years now, and this is Chris Avellone. Just to be aware, he has a delay on his camera, which we are aware of, but we're gonna roll through it. And yeah, so Chris, thank you so much for joining. I've been aware of your work, I think, most of my adult life, following your games career from the early days, and can't wait to hear more about that. But I'm super happy you're here. Chris has been an amazing support for me and for the work that I'm doing, and it's just an honor, man, to have you here. So, welcome, and why don't you tell us who you are in case we have people in here who don't know who the most important person in games is.
Oh, well, well, Curtis, I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, so I've worked on way too many role-playing games and other games throughout the industry in a variety of genres, but mostly I'm known for writing for games, and it's something that I really enjoy.
Awesome. So let's get into, we've talked a few times off camera and been getting to know each other a little bit, but I would love to hear, like, first of all, like, where did you grow up, and tell me a little bit about the experience of growing up and how maybe that formulated some of your love and passion for storytelling.
Yes, I grew up in Northern Virginia, which was pretty nice. A little bit as a sub, it's Alexandria, a little suburb outside of, not a little suburb anymore, outside of Washington D.C. Um, and growing up in the 70s, early 80s, if you really like things like D&D and gaming, it's a very insular activity, and it wasn't really quite the well accepted community that it is today. Like computer games were a little bit more acceptable, but things like tabletop RPGs, not everyone was really thrilled if you played them. So,
Right.
so a lot of my desire to eventually do game writing was just okay. Well, I really enjoy playing role playing games with my friends. None of them ever want a game master, so I have to do all the work. Um,
Classic.
but at the same time, I discovered that that was actually really enjoyable because, like, when you have a really good role playing game session, players are really excited, they're really engaged, and you walk away from that, you're like, wow, I as an entertainer, I feel like I did a really good job there. I felt, pretty great, like I did a good job. And then that sort of formed my perspective for like, wow, okay, well, here's the appreciation for being a storyteller. Like I'm watching these people in real time having an enjoyable experience. And then I started trying to look for more ways to like get them even more engaged. Like, okay, like, well, learn more about their backstories, their characters, things they want their characters to do in game. Like what's the fantasy that their characters are trying to
Hmm.
pursue? Like, how as a storyteller do I help support that? And that whole methodology went all the way from the early days, just teenage gaming, to all the way doing like pen and paper testing for like Interplay's Fallout 3. Like I applied a lot of those same techniques even for like more quote unquote modern style role playing games.
Interesting. Okay, I want to come back to that because I want to hear your thoughts about narrative in games. But what were you running back in the day? Like, what was the game you guys started with, and did you stay there? Did you move into other types of genres and different types of games?
We did a variety of stuff. We started with the Temple of Elemental Evil.
Hmm.
Oh, I'm sorry, no, Cult of the Reptile God.
Okay.
And we formed a core group of players, and we eventually transitioned from Cult of the Reptile God, which is a very small, like minor D&D module back in
Yeah.
the day, and then went to Temple of Elemental Evil, and literally spent like 3 or 4 years trying to play through that module, and they almost got to the end before they just threw up their hand. We threw up our hands like, nah, like we're all going off to college, we're all going our separate ways, we barely game anymore. Zug to me wins,
Yeah.
you know, as wins. But and then we also did excursions into like Champions, a Call of Cthulhu, a
Okay.
whole bunch of role playing games. So it
Yeah.
wasn't just one genre, but superheroes was the most.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I think I got your mic cut out there for a
Oh,
second.
I
Oh,
got it now.
okay,
Can
yeah,
you hear me now?
you're back. Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
sorry. I'm so sorry.
no, that's all right. Yeah, okay. So I mean, I grew up too. Like, first of all, I grew up in a quite a conservative Christian home, so the D&D thing wasn't allowed. But I got around it with the Star Wars West End games, and
Oh, nice.
the classic. And, but the thing is like I'm sure you can relate to this too. I read the book, but I had no concept of like what this was. Like they would give you a little blurb at the beginning, but I just bought it and I knew kind of the concept, but it took me a while to figure it out. So I'd literally be writing a story and then the players would just be the passengers and they would roll dice when I told them to. It was awful.
But it worked.
It worked. We got through it. It got better over time, but we got there. But yeah, so you started with some tabletop role playing games and you wanted to write in games. How on earth did you even know where to look to start writing for video? Like, where did that journey begin?
Well, actually, I didn't know that I wanted to write for games. That ended up being a mistake. So the first piece of advice for anyone out there is like, if you think you're targeted in a certain career, like don't ignore the other like tangential careers that might be associated with
Okay,
it. So
that's good
originally, like
advice.
I wanted to do what you did with Rat Queens. Like I wanted to be a comic book
Oh,
writer, and I
really?
wanted to be, oh yeah, totally. And then I wanted to like write novels and short stories. And I'm like, well, yeah, games have stories, but like there's not really a job for them. And then to my surprise, like writing for tabletop games like Champions and whatnot, they're like,
Right.
oh well, there's this computer game company, Interplay, out in California, and if you wanted to apply there, we'll give you a good recommendation. And I'm like, so the way it worked was build a foundation of other work. And as soon as someone starts paying you for your work, no matter how little, that's a sign that you can start advancing. It's like, oh wow, like people are recognizing the value in what I do. And even if it's $50 every 2 months, if that's still something. And then also you're building up working relationships. We're like, hey, if the editor didn't like you and the narrative director for the franchise didn't like you, they wouldn't be willing to recommend you. But the fact that you are turning out good work and they really can't pay you anyway, um, they're happy to recommend other places that will sustain you. And like when I first got to Interplay, I'm like, oh wow, I can write for computer games, but what I really want to do is write for tabletop in my spare time. And then over time, I'm like, oh well, wait a minute, I can actually channel all that energy into games because stories are evolving to the point where I can tell the same sort of stories in a computer game that I could around the tabletop. So where to look is just it can be tough, but just look for tangential careers to pursue, and try and pursue companies that allow like advancements within their ranks versus the ones that hire outside.
So where did you make that transition then? Like what was your very first job?
My first job was working at a toy store, which was fun as it sounds. Our manager was very chill, but the first job I had was mostly just doing contract writing and then continually sending pitches and proposals. I the and I don't know if anyone out there has heard of Monty Cook, but Monty Cook was a big designer both at Hero Games, and then he went on to like work on Dungeons and Dragons and then go on to Numenera. And he was one of the first guys that I kept setting pitches to. And he got so sick of me. He's like, okay, well, you've sent like 7 or 8 of these things. I haven't sent you any feedback. Like, please leave me alone, basically. But what happened was he left,
Okay.
and all those pitches were sitting around. And the new editor came in and he's like, oh crap, we have to publish something. He's like, well, this guy seems to be prolific and annoying. So why don't we publish one of his things? Once that happened, like things took off. So I guess if there's anything to thank Monty Cook for, it's completely ignoring and not being supportive. But he's a nice guy. Like at that time, he was so stressed out and just had no patience for me. So I'm like, oh, okay. But then the next editor did. So just be persistent and maybe your time will come.
Yeah, that's kind of the advice I give to a lot of younger writers in general when they ask. It really is true that persistence, like most people, if they get like 5, 10, 15 rejections, and they think it's a lot, and they quit. They just stop. And it's like, if you wait for the 20th, you're just going to be that little closer to getting to the goal, you know? And it's, yeah, just the stick to itness. I mean, for me, I mean, I think I had like 30, 40 rejection
Hey
letters
Chris,
before
I'm so
I,
sorry. I think your mic is cutting out. So I
oh,
actually am seeing your beautiful features,
oh,
but I
okay.
can't understand what you're saying.
Okay, hold on. Let's turn my mic down. Maybe it's just
Might
cutting
be
out
a
because it's
million.
blowing. Is that better? Can you hear me now? No? Hold on here. Can you hear?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know what I had to turn the mic down a little bit, but um yeah, I think it's just that kind of stick to itness, and like I said, I had so many rejections, like in the upwards of 50 before I got my first publication. And I really do recommend that people just keep trying. And there's some people that I know that were waiting years to break into comic book industry. They
Yeah.
were 10, 11 years, and they kept going, and it paid off. And you know, it's not always going to, but that sticking it out longer when everyone else quits, I don't know. It's that means you're still there when they're not. So I think that's
Yeah, I mean,
good advice.
sure, sure, luck helps, but like what you're saying about persistence definitely will help you win the
Yeah.
day. 'Cause it's just you keep applying, and the same thing is true like when you're trying to pitch stuff in the game industry. Like you might pitch like 50 ideas for a game,
Yeah.
and like, you'll be lucky if one of them hits. Like it's that kind of odds.
Yeah. Yeah, and to be able to sell people your idea as well. It's like it's easy to have a great idea, but the tough part is conveying it in a way that people can get it in there. That's the one thing I really realize is so important working in games is you need to learn how to, I mean, that's just directing, I suppose, but you need to learn how to translate the ideas into solid words that are clear enough that people go, I know what this is. That's not as easy as you think it is. I've come to learn.
Yeah, and then like it's not only a matter of like, hey, well, I can write really good dialogue, but like, can you also write like a good technical document that explains how your dialogue editor is going to work in a way that the engineers can understand with a minimal
Yeah.
questions? So like, the writing needs that everyone needs that skill within the game industry. So it's not just like, hey, I'm a really creative writer, but like also when it comes down to technical documentation of
Yeah.
describing how a certain UI works, like that's also an important skill to have as well.
Yeah, and I imagine I'm at, I mean, we could probably talk for hours about this stuff, but you've been in the industry and you've seen worked on so many different role playing games that I'm sure you've got a lot of insights about what works and what doesn't. I mean, when you came in, I'm assuming that your tabletop background really did help with, you know, because you did a lot of narrative design. You still do, but that's a lot of what you were doing in the early days. How much crossover was there for that in the way that you were thinking about the writing in a game?
A lot of it was trying to look for more ways to weave the character's backstory into the narrative. And the other thing that translated, but it's not really a tabletop skill. It's just learning how to deep dive on a subject, and like bring in like all the pragmatic things like a commoner or someone viewing the situation from an outside perspective would do. Like there's been so many like TV shows that I think have gotten that deep dive right, where you're like, oh wow, someone like really thought deeply on this topic. No matter how ludicrous it is, they executed it really well.
Mm,
And that's a skill to have. It requires just a lot of focus and thinking about what the situation is. So the example I usually use for this is like this first season of Jessica Jones. And I'm like, okay, let's take a ludicrous concept that so and so can like control minds. Okay, that's ridiculous. And we have Jessica Jones. Now let's craft this entire season. And someone sat down and realistically thought what David Tennant's character, what his life would be like if he had this power. And they
mm,
thought intelligently about it. And I'm like, wow, like that's and also all the ramifications of what he does, like all that stuff was really grounded and
yeah,
plausible, even though the premise was ludicrous. Um, but that's a writer's skill, and
yeah.
I learned a lot of that in tabletop, just approaching it from like, what's a realistic and plausible take on something that seems fantastical, and like it can work wonders in a story.
Yeah, and you're talking about like the depth of the character, thinking more than just this is the archetype, but like what is the actual motivation? Where do they come from? Which, I mean, it's not that common in games. I mean, at least in my experience, it's usually about the visual, the archetype. Um, I mean, obviously, I'm a fan of Disco Elysium, and there's so much thought that's put. When people play that game, they're experiencing something that's so deep, but I think often people don't really understand like why they're so attached to something. But it is that layering work that a proper world building or proper writing for characters, it really makes such a huge difference. And I think that's why that game was such a huge. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that game was a success, but putting that time into the depth of things is it just makes everything just feel real, like feel lived in.
Yeah, and I think Robert Kurvitz and his team, they had a lot of that deep dive with Disco Elysium, where
Yeah,
like they knew the concepts they wanted to explore. I felt like the world had a really good set of franchise bookends for like how it communicated itself to the player.
yeah,
Also, he did a really clever thing where like he also made sure that no matter how strange the world was, there was always something relatable, whether it's your cop buddy Kim you can talk to,
mm,
or just the archetype of who the main character is. Because amnesiac detective waking up from a bender is actually like like a cliche that people understand and can grasp.
yeah,
And then Robert takes you on this other journey where it's like, wow, now the train's starting. Oh wow, where are we going now?
yeah,
But like because you have those identifiable concepts, it's easier for people to get into it
yeah,
and then realize there's a much deeper experience far beyond that, which I think is
yeah.
was one of the big wonders of Disco Elysium, which I also love.
Yeah, it was definitely one of my favorite games. I had a chance to meet them last summer in Estonia. It was really cool to hang out with them. And as far as you've worked on some pretty massive titles, and you kind of have worn like lead writer and narrative designer. What were some of the early things that you learned in your career in games that kind of has stuck through to now, where it's really shaped how you think about games?
Um, there's a few things. One is, and forgive me, some of these things are very pragmatic, but one is when you're writing a game, you have to realize that you're writing it for at least maybe seven or 9 other languages. So, like in the sense of like, okay, well, will my English aesthetic hold up if this is translated? Is one thing you kind of have to keep in mind, as well as
Okay.
be aware that every change you make in a game is going to have ripple effects across 9 other languages plus voice acting. So like from a pragmatic standpoint, you learn to be aware that it's not just putting words in the game. Like there's a whole management and production line you have to be aware of, which was a really big shock for me because it meant that early on I realized my ability to edit, change, iterate was greatly affected by the fact that there was this other huge pipeline waiting in the wings
Yeah.
that had to have everything locked down as early as possible in order to do it like perfectly. And the problem is like games keep changing, and the way Interplay was at the time, like you could never get or guarantee a certain character would be there or a level, so things would get cut all the time. So like edits in that respect sometimes became problematic. Anyway, that's one thing.
Yeah.
That's a managerial production thing. Aesthetically, it was learning that my words that they're not precious. They're not like little snowflakes running around. What you really want to do when you're telling your story is the words are just a entry door. What you really want to do is get your audio guy, get your environment artist, get your visual effects artist, all make them aware of the story you want to tell either across the game or in a very specific area, and then they help you flush that out because
Yeah.
there's so much stuff that you're not going to be able to convey with just a talking head, and that's probably the worst way to do it.
Yeah.
Versus, hey, let's set up like a ruined village, like with all these like little inventory item touchstones and props that tell a story that reinforce a narrative you're going to have later. Like that, recognizing that like there's more people involved in telling that story, giving them the information they need, and then letting them support the story along with your words. That's an important part of any
Mm.
game writing.
Yeah. I love that because, I mean, I think if you come from like tabletop games, you really realize how much stories are better when you bring in different minds. You know, like that's something that
Mm.
we're used to as storytellers with from gaming backgrounds. And so that idea that the words are just one component, but they all have to sing the same music, you know, they have to all kind of resonate with each other. And when that happens, it's like, yeah, you can get some really, it's like the world is telling the story, the characters and the art and the, but yeah, I love that. That's one of my favorite things about games. And I find, I'd be curious what you think about, because you've worked for quite large companies as well. Like how, I guess, what is your experience in the bigger games industry and in that jazz, as I call it? Like, has it worked for you traditionally? Like, have you been able to maintain that kind of creative collaboration in an environment like that, or has that been a struggle?
Um, Sometimes, and it depends on the company. Uh, there have been times where like they will give you free reign to implement a plot or a character or an idea, and that's great. Other times there's been challenges because story is one of those things that sort of everybody can understand. It's not like you come in as a programmer and you discover like, well, only really engineers can read and review your code. With a story, everybody from the CEO all the way down to QA can weigh in on it, and then they
Right.
give their feedback for like, well, here's the kind of stories I like,
Yeah.
uh, and that can be a challenge because they might bring you in to like write a better story or improve like the last story experience, like when I was working on Dying Light 2, they had brought me in because Dying Light 1 story wasn't at the level that they wanted. So when Dying Light 2 happened, they're like, oh, okay, well, we really want to up our story game because that was the only part that reviewers didn't seem to like really care for, or weren't as excited about. And but then when you get there, you might have the challenge of, well, yeah, but they don't really want you to write to your skill set. Like they want you to take an idea that they may have and then
Right.
bring it, which you can do. But like there might be issues or challenges with how they're doing it. And if that person's not receptive to why they brought you on board, like it just ends up being kind of a mess. But you still try and work with it anyway, and hopefully repeat examples and knocking on the door like, hey, like let's try this, like just let's play it out and see how it flows.
Yeah.
Like hopefully it sinks in after a while, but it doesn't always.
Yeah. Again, these are things that I could, we'll take these calls later, Chris. But, you know, I'm just thinking too, like some of the titles you've worked on, what was an experience that just really sung? Like there was just a vibe amongst the team where it was just like, I mean, obviously you had problems, but what was like where it's just like everything really felt great, even with the hurdles?
Planescape Torment, one of the first games I worked on, it
Nice.
had it had that flow. It almost sent me to the hospital, but when I wasn't worried about going to the hospital, there were moments where I'm like, oh wow, this scene's really working, or oh wow, I'm really happy with this character delivery, or wow, this quest is working really well. Like that wasn't the case for the whole game by any means, but there were plenty of times during the development cycle where I'm like, wow, even though like it's 160 hours, like I still feel like good stuff is coming out of it. Yeah, so I was really proud of what we were able to accomplish. It was a pretty small team, but everyone seemed really energized. Our art lead was great. Our programming lead was great. Like everyone just sort of was on the same page. But there was also one other important aspect to it, which I think also Tim Kaine from Fallout
Mm,
1 would probably appreciate, is it helps when you're at a company where either you're independent and can just make the choices you need to make with it, responsibly. And another thing to be at a large company where the eye of Sauron isn't on you.
yeah.
Because when that happens, sometimes you can make that jazz and that magic
Yeah.
because the company is still supporting you, but they're letting your voice come through. And it's not as generic or watered down as it might have been across 20 different managerial reviews.
You sound like you're speaking from experience.
Sometimes the feedback gets pretty weird. You're like, well, that's awfully specific, but you feel strongly about it. And even though you can't articulate the reasons why you want it, it may not hurt the game. So let's just move on and I'll do that.
Really? Okay. Yeah, I mean that's the funniest thing is like yeah, or maybe not even the funniest, the frustrating is I don't mind when there's suggestions or revisions, but that seem weird, but at least explain to me why so I know how to properly make to make those
Yeah,
changes.
well, I mean, but that's a reasonable request because you want to know first off like what your boss likes in terms of a narrative, like what specifically is the things that he's getting excited about in terms of this game. Like
Yeah.
that's important to know. Like I really so I want that feedback. Like I want those details. So the next time I deliver something, like it's more in line with what you want and the project's vision because I'm only the writer. I'd say only the writer, but like there's an overall vision that the writing's supposed to be leading towards.
Mm,
And like the more compass points you can give me and the more like road signs, great, because then I can do a better job for you. So I do appreciate that. What I don't like is when you get the very vague general, well, I don't really care for that, or like that reminds me of something popular that I hate, which is always a really weird thing for any creative director to say. Like it's fine if you hate something that's popular, but like you should always try and understand why it's popular because part
right.
of your job as creative director is, what's actually gonna make this game sell. And if
Yeah.
you're like, well, I hate everything that's popular and does well, okay, man, but like as long as you're keeping the critiques for like what makes those things successful, great.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, I've definitely encountered that before. What would I want to go back to Planescape because I mean that is considered like the pinnacle of the CRPG. You know, it took kind of what was in Baldur's Gate and it took it in an interesting direction that was more fantastical but less at the same time somehow. So what was the process on that? How did you get involved in over the course of the project? Like what were you kind of maintaining and what was the hat you were wearing for that project?
Yeah, so I'll probably start with a bunch of production stuff that all led to this, and it actually does feed into the writing. So we had licensed the Infinity Engine from BioWare. The Infinity Engine was the technology they used to make Baldur's Gate 1, Baldur's Gate
Yeah.
2. And then also Brian Fargo had spent money getting the Planescape license from D&D, but internally, the only Planescape game we had wasn't going well. It got canceled. And then we got some of their resources, and they were like, "Well, wait, but we still have to make a Planescape game." So, like, well, okay, well, why don't we take the Baldur's Gate engine since it's D&D, and then
Yeah.
we'll do an isometric version of Planescape. We're making use of the license, and we'll turn out a role playing game like Baldur's Gate. And so that's what was given to me. Where it's like, okay, here we go, and I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, so I don't know anything about Planescape. I know very little. So for step one, do the research.
Yeah.
So I went back to a premise that I'd given the studio director when I first interviewed. I'm like, oh, it'd be really cool to like do a game that starts in the mortuary and it starts in the death screen, and you try and figure out how you got there. And he was like, oh, I think that's pretty cool. And then he gave me a job, and I'm like, okay, cool. And then a few years go by, and he's like, oh, well, now we're doing a Planescape game for real.
Oh
I'm like,
wow.
oh, okay, well, I'd like to use that original idea. So I just did.
Nice.
Then the next stage was like, okay, we'll figure out all the elements that make Planescape what it is, and then figure out how the game's going to introduce those. Like, okay, well, they have this element, that element, like, and then like it becomes a methodical process. And also one advantage was like not getting too locked down on everything early on. Recognize that your story's fluid, recognize that your characters are fluid, and then once you design a little bit of them, they might
Yeah.
have their own voices and their own characters that come out. And so letting them breathe a bit in interesting ways can make a story even better rather than just rigidly adhering to your very first outline.
Yeah, I find it's interesting the balance I think when you're trying to write a role playing game like author intent versus like the player freedom. I feel like it's such a delicate line in CRPGs. I even
Yeah.
actually even in tabletop games too, right? Like I much more lean into here's the world and I fill in the gaps as the players tell a story. I'm much more into that now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I find it such a interesting balance in computer games because you don't want to overwrite it, but you know what I mean? You want to give the player freedom, but you want a structured narrative. Like, what's your thinking about? I'm really curious how you think about what that balance and what you're thinking about when you're creating those narrative designs. I don't think people think about how actually complex that is.
Tabletop gaming was really good for training me to recognize that trying to craft a very delicate stage and have specific events play out for the players was always a huge mistake, because that would never play out that way. So I try to take that philosophy into computer games and recognize I mean, it's what you were saying, where it's like, okay, well, I create like a stage for this to
Mm,
play out. I try and give them interesting NPCs to bounce ideas off of, or interesting elements of the world that will react to things that they do, and also like inform them of various things. But overall, like recognize that it's a communal storytelling process. Like the players involved, how are you letting them express their character? How are you letting them like do their specific character build, and like how are their skills used in the environment in a way that makes them feel cool? So like there were some elements with that, but then like when it comes to narrative, that ends up being a whole toolbox of like, well, the players are here for a certain experience, whether it's Star Wars or killing zombies. Like, have I identified what those touchstones are,
yeah.
and is the game delivering on that power fantasy in a way that players familiar with that type of game or that franchise like and enjoy, and then hopefully you can add some intelligent deep dives on top of that. So
Yeah, it's because you've seen the game that I'm working on. One of the things that I always struggle with is like the idea of the power fantasy and like for instance, like again back to Disco Elysium, I was just reading what their tagline is basically what kind of cop will you be. That's a great entry point, right? That's always the hard one though. It's like if you're telling maybe a less traditional narrative story where you're not one character but you're taking care of a bunch of characters, like whose perspective are you writing from and how do you approach it? It can get complicated really quickly. That's where that stuff starts to really kind of mess with my head, because it's so much easier to have one entry point and see the game through that one perspective. But it's interesting to try to take different narrative perspectives in a game, and I'm curious what you think. Where do you think narrative is going to end up in games? And by that I mean, I still think we're kind of in the infancy in storytelling in games in a lot of ways. Where do you see it going, or where would you like to see it go?
well, one big discussion point in game stories is just the fact of how much information seems to be communicated just through the standard menu driven dialogue option system. And I don't know if anybody with has really found a way to really break out of that
Mm,
menu selection process. And that's always been a big question mark in terms of, okay, well, what is going to be the next thing that actually, evolves that particular narrative mechanism? Because there's plenty of others, like, hey, visual storytelling, hey, audio triggers to help reinforce X, Y, and Z. Like, you don't need a talking head like to
right.
give this information. But if you do have one, then like how do we make that interaction experience better? And I think VR is going down that route. But
Mm,
things like if interactions with people like actually did take into account eye tracking, like are you making eye contact with the person that you're speaking to in this role playing game? Like what are your gestures like? Maybe this person's really reserved and doesn't like it when you move around a lot or
yeah.
make big expensive gestures. Like so, I think there's elements like that where it can become more simulating a natural conversation. But there have been narrative techniques that have not aged very well over like the past few decades, and try and hopefully exploring new techniques for getting around those would be welcome. I just don't happen to know what those are at the moment.
Yeah, it is true that like that menu dialogue system has remained the same, but it's so ingrained that it's even just me sitting here now, I'm like, yeah, how do you do it differently? That's
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's also really easy for players because then it like becomes like a menu list for most games. We're like, okay, well, I made that dialogue option. Like, okay, I thoroughly explored this dialogue,
yeah,
and then they're like, okay, well, now I feel good about it because I'm sure that I got everything in there.
yeah.
And I admit as a player, I kind of like that, but I do recognize the more mechanical interrogation aspects of it. What I like about Disco Elysium is they leaned into that. And they're like, okay, well, you're like a human can opener, and it's just what you do is you interrogate people. I'm like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool. Like they lean into the conceit of that of those dialogue options. I thought that was
Yeah, which is really clever, and I think too, one of the things that I think that they did to move things forward, we're just gonna end up talking about their Disco Elysium. That's fine. I think they did a lot of cool things. It
you should have invited Robert, man. Like I could have just called him and go, hey Robert, man, you should have shut up. This was fucking great.
next time. But yeah, I think what I really liked that they did, and I don't know if many, I'm sure you picked up on it, but how failure was often as fun. And
Yeah.
in tabletop role, have you ever played Fiasco?
No.
Oh, dude, you got to play that game. It's basically a Coen Brothers tabletop role playing game. It's GMless. You're telling a story as it kind of unfolds, and has a very Coen Brothers film type feel. It's awesome. You should check it out. But
All right.
one of the great components of that game is because it's a Coen Brothers, and you're playing a bunch of simple people in a small town getting up to no good. It's fun when your characters fail because it's so entertaining for the story that's emerging. And I really feel like they nailed that in Disco Elysium, that you're not saves coming, because it's just as funny or more interesting sometimes when you fail. And I think that's actually one of the unsung heroes of that game that I wish more people would do. I hope people do more of that. I know I want to.
Yeah, also with a lot of games not really being friendly about you reloading last saves, sometimes having failure options or what I call equally interesting options,
Hmm.
that just makes the whole experience more interesting. Because like the worst thing you can do with a role playing game is look up a fact on it and then discover there's all the right options. Like, oh, well, that's all that. Like at that point, you probably haven't done a really good job of reactivity. Because like
Right.
generally, you should figure out what the archetypes are, figure out what choices the player can make, and then make both of all the options the players can pursue, make them interesting and not like, oh wow, you fucked up. Yeah,
Yeah.
like it should have some benefit in the environment, and like that was part of our design standards. Back in Obsidian, in the sense
Yeah.
of like, well, it should lead somewhere interesting, like, and there shouldn't be like insta win options for dialogue. Oh, you made your speech check and now you get everything. It's like that so bores me. I'm just like, do you want people to think about the dialogue or not? I don't know. So,
Mm. Yeah, that is something I think about too, that it would be interesting to create a system where the dialogue choices, rather than having like a skill check or anything, it's like you have to pay attention to how the character reacts. Like, I know that's it's a bit complex, but
it's hard and it can
yeah.
really bite your ass. But yeah, because then in Fallout New Vegas, that bit me in the ass because if you pay attention to one of the final bosses, it's pretty clear that if you even make the suggestion that he's retreating, like he's going to lose his shit.
Right.
But you have to pay attention.
Yeah.
And then, like, even after you make all the skill checks, there's like one dialogue option that's the landmine. And it goes, well, good. Like, now that you're retreating, blah, 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 blah. And at that point, no matter what choice you make, he attacks you because, like,
uh
you just can't. But the problem is, people weren't used to that type of convention. So, like, that ends up coming as a surprise.
yeah.
So, that's an aesthetic that you want to do throughout. But ideally, you do want people to hopefully pay attention to your dialogue and not slam through it. But there are players that will do that.
What do you I want to talk about Fallout New Vegas in a second, but what do you think, what's a way to get people to actually engage with the dialogue without skipping? Because, like, for instance, I played a lot of Baldur's Gate 3. I did. But I skipped a lot of the dialogue because a lot of it, again, the skill checks didn't matter. Really, it didn't seem like you could just re-roll. It's like, what's the point? But how do you get people to like really engage with it and not skip past it beyond being good writing, I suppose?
I think it's a matter of giving tools to the player that don't point in the direction of how to win. It just gives them more information to make an informed decision. And what
Hmm.
I mean by that, I'll give two examples. So one is, so like when Tim Kaine was doing Fallout 1, there was a perk called empathy. And what it would do is when you were talking to people, it would highlight options the NPC would like in green. And it would highlight
Hmm.
options they would respond negatively to or hostile to in red. Now,
Interesting.
initially that seems like an insta win button, but it's not. What it tells you is if I want to provoke this NPC to cause like all the guards to rush out of the storehouse or whatever, so I can sneak in the back, um, then I can choose the hostile options to provoke them. Like, but that's not a bad decision. That's an informed decision.
Right.
Also, when we were doing the groundwork for Fallout Van Buren Interplay, which hopefully was going to become Fallout 3, but that never happened.
Right.
Another thing we tried to do was speech skill and perception would allow you to read people before you had a dialogue with them and get a sense for like, oh, wow, that guy, like all his clothes are really well pressed despite the apocalyptic environment and like everything, like he's, it looks like he keeps everything orderly and clean. Like that's information that tells you like don't use vague or messy dialogue options, like be clear and precise.
Right.
And then like speech skill would give you clues on how to interact. And like we did a little bit of that with Lynette in Fallout 2, where like once you realize that she likes being called like, first citizen, like address her with respect versus, hey, what's up? And like her reputation goes down. But you're like, oh, of course, first citizen, yes, first citizen, like her reputation goes up, and you get and like, but that because that's the kind of character that she is.
Right.
And so, including more options where like you're asked to pay attention to the person you're speaking to, be aware of what their quirks and traits are, and then figure out, well, what do I want out of this conversation? Like, what's my agenda versus
Yeah.
their agenda? And how do I achieve that with the more information that I know? And it's more interesting when the speech skills and abilities give you more information versus here's how to win.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's a tough line. Again, it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about how much authorship and perspective, which is kind of hard to nail sometimes. So let's talk about Fallout New Vegas. That I think that was such an interesting game because Fallout 1 and 2 was this isometric, but Bethesda did their take. So let's leave it at that. They did their take, and you guys did Fallout New Vegas, which to me I felt kind of had understood the tone and I guess the concept because a lot of you guys had worked on the original. How did that happen, and what was that process like coming back to it? I mean, it's always a different engine and all that kind of stuff, but like, what was that like coming back to it again?
It was great. Um, Financially and managerially, it was not great because all the titles we'd done up to that point, um, our studio wasn't in great shape. So when Bethesda came with a contract, it's not like we could argue a lot,
Right.
which is sad, but it happens. And to be honest, like we'd sort of put ourselves in that situation. So the contract was a bit aggressive. It was a bit lean, but we agreed to it and we thought we could do it. So once we had that, regardless of that, we were all really excited because
Mm,
we had a bunch of ideas for Fallout way back in the day, back in Interplay. We're like, oh wow, like we can use some of that stuff again. That's great. We can tell a new story and and technology was never Obsidian's like strong point. Like our games, unfortunately, they would have a lot of bugs. They'd have technical
mm,
issues. So we'd often get other people's like game engines and then build and then cater to our strength, which was like, hey, well, we'll write an entertaining adventure
yeah.
on top of someone else's technology. And that's something we'd done all the way back at Black Isle. Like, oh wow, we'll take BioWare's Infinity engine since they can do an engine,
Right.
and then we'll make like Planescape Torment or whatever it happens. That might have been the Icewind Dale. Okay, for the Icewind Dale. But always those were kind of like where we're bringing our narrative to a foundation you've already
Yeah.
left. And I know people like, oh, Gamebryo and Bethesda's engine, like, oh wow, it's really, and they have a lot of complaints. For
Yeah.
us, it's like, wow, this engine, it mostly works. Like it doesn't work for everything that we need it to, but
Right.
like we're able to build an entire world out. That's insane. So for me, it was kind of like enjoyable to take all the strengths that Bethesda had, and then we were able to add, oh, well, we really know Fallout, and we have these narrative skill sets we're bringing to it. Let's unite those, and New Vegas was the happy result. Like we were all really stoked to work on it. Like it was tense at times, and um, it was hard to get everything done, and there's stuff we probably shouldn't have tried to get in, but I never thought Bethesda was hostile or trying to screw us, and there are times where they actually gave us more money to make the game better, like with our animation sets. Like we showcased, hey, here's the old animations. Here's some new ones that we could do if we had the budget to hire some more animators. And the Bethesda looked at, they're like, yep, go ahead. And I'm like, wow, like they that's an expense they don't have to do, but they genuinely want it to look better. And like they would make decisions like that.
Nice. So that game, man, how long ago did that game come out? I don't even want to.
I have no idea.
It's like 15 years. It's been a while.
Well,
What did you work on after Fallout New Vegas?
oh wow, I feel like my head's been completely cleansed after New Vegas.
Okay.
I think
Hitting you with the hard
what did
questions.
happen? Well, let's see. I'm trying to think of what else was going on at that time. So I got on New Vegas late because we were trying to finish up Alpha Protocol,
Right.
which had its share of challenges. So I went on New Vegas, and then we also had Dungeon Siege 3 going on at the time.
Wow.
But after that, I actually can't remember exactly what I transitioned on to. Like after that, I had to give it some thought. Maybe I'm blacking out or something. I
So I mean, when you're working on that many projects, it probably does become become a bit of a blur.
don't know. I
What
forgot my own history.
yeah. I'm the same way. I couldn't tell you when some of my comic projects worked on. It all kind of blurs. Like when Rat Queens came up as like being 10 years old, I was like, what? How's that possible? It's just one of those things. The time passes,
Oh
but
man, that's so like I told you this already, but like me and a few of the guys from work would like Rat Queens. Like we would go to the comic book store every Wednesday, and Rat Queens was one of the things we
no,
absolutely looked
nice.
for. Like our main concept guy Brian Menzie on Fallout, like he loved it too. Like, oh man, this art's pretty fucking cool. And, like
Nice.
it was something to look forward to. So thank you for that. That was awesome.
No, no, I appreciate that. It's funny, like I really see that it did well for a few reasons, but the one thing was that it really crossed over with the game, like tabletop and with the video games. And I would have people come up to me at the conventions and go, "Oh yeah, I bought it," and then I bought a copy for every single person in my gaming group. It's like it
Nice.
was just kind of that vibe. And I mean, it was. I mean, it's clear that I grew up playing tabletop role playing games and doing commentary on some of the stuff I thought was so stupid, like dwarven ale. That just was always really funny to me because it's like, is there human ale? Is there elf ale? Like it's very strange. But
There's
those,
human ale. We just don't talk about it.
yeah. So it's just like, yeah, making fun of the tropes.
I think another compliment, Curtis, is just at Obsidian, we'd pitched to Wizards of the Coast D&D games many times, and
Yeah.
like we also were reviewing a lot of the modules and stuff they were doing at that time, and like it just felt like it didn't really have the energy that like the older D&D modules had. Like, oh, everyone remembers Against the Giants, but I had a really hard time remembering anything that stood out like
Mm.
really as strongly in more recent D&D. So like when I was reading Rat Queens, I was like, wow, this is like D&D, but like without the game pitches and like it's fun. And I'm like, wow, like, and that kind of unnerved me because I'm like, when did it stop? When did it stop being fun? Like I thought D&D was also like that. Like, well, it could have been more fun.
Yeah.
So thank you for that perspective that you showed.
Hey, no problem. Yeah, it's I just definitely channeled, and I think that's something that's so great about tabletop role playing games, especially if you're working in games. Like it really does tell you that story can be so fun, and maybe the archetype that you write is like this is what's expected in games. It's like tabletop always just surprises me with the creativity of different people working together and how much fun and how funny it can be. And it's like I want to try
Yeah,
anything I work on. I want to transport like for instance the game we're working on now. I've already developed it as a tabletop game. We've been running it for like 2 or 3 months, and it's hilarious. Like I want to transfer that energy into this game, and it's like write down the funny jokes and the funny one-liners and put that straight in there. And it's like, I mean, I would encourage anyone if you're working on a game to actually do that because you get a feel for the world and the vibe, what makes it fun to play. I don't know if you've done that. Have you ever done something like that?
There's been some experiences that are similar. Like, because one of the best things about tabletop is what you were saying about sort of embracing failure and making it interesting.
Yeah.
That's tabletop 100%. Like, as a GM, you have a hope for where things will go.
Right.
If you're playing Fallout pen and paper and Josh Sawyer ends up criticaling the major NPC antagonist planned for the next 10 sessions, you're like, you have this moment of, oh, fuck. And then you're like, 5 minutes later, you're like, oh, wait a minute. That could actually be kind of interesting because
Yeah.
that changed the dynamics I had expected in the following ways. And then you watch the world kind of settle into a new position. And
Mm.
that's exciting. So, like, bringing that sort of tabletop experience and embracing the interesting aspects of failure, I
Yeah.
think that is worthwhile stuff for game design for sure.
Yeah. Totally. Do you still play? Do you still get around a table with
No,
friends
not as
or
much anymore.
not much?
It's hard to get people together, even with all the new applications for like doing remote
Yeah.
gaming. It's hard to get people together. I know that and you're probably the same boat where like people have all sorts of ideas for campaigns, but like nothing seems to happen, and I certainly don't have time to run one. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so I don't play as much anymore. We used to play at lunch back at Obsidian, but it was kind of infrequent.
Okay. Yeah, I mean it's funny. Like I really want to infuse that with what we're doing, and I think like almost for certain I want to make sure that as a team we're actually playing a game in the world just to make sure that we keep that interesting energy up because
That
you know
that's a smart way to do it, because especially if you have the time. Because
yeah
like when we were working on Fallout Van Buren, being able to run the Fallout pen and paper sessions for like 20 or 30 sessions before we actually jumped into
oh
development was a
wow
huge help. Like if you have the time, because like you gather all the reference art for the locations, you start drafting out all the quests. You have about like anywhere from 4 to 8 different people of different Fallout character builds stopping on your world in real time. You start seeing opportunities, and then like as much as like you design out, where you're like, okay, well, I'm going to run this pen and paper session like I imagine the game starting. Suddenly 5 of those characters do something
yeah
interesting the rules allow, and you're like, oh wow, I can make this quest line better, or oh wow, that's a twist I hadn't considered. And that live feedback from the players who will eventually be developers was
yeah
fantastic. It's great.
yeah it's like you kind of I call it like creative language. You're kind of creating that because there's a familiarity as you build this thing together live that we've all got this thing in our head now that we're sharing this story, which is one of the cool things that the creative mind can do is we can share story together. All we share our headspace, if we do really good storytelling, which is
Yeah,
like magic, isn't it? It's like magic.
those players have all sorts of great stuff. Because so, like, a follow example was, so in New Vegas, there's this thing where the super mutants sometimes get a little bit unstable, and like
Yes.
they have sanity issues. That actually ended up being an idea that was inspired by the pen and paper game. It's one of the characters that made a super mutant. I'm like, oh, well, wouldn't it be cool if like he had some of the master's psionic abilities or whatever happened to be, but he actually has visions of like things that had happened or will happen or might
Yeah.
new interpretation. But all of that stuff came from his character background. I'm like, oh wow. I'm like, okay, well, he set this character. Wouldn't it be cool if I built on what he did and then he builds on it, and then eventually that made it into Fallout New Vegas.
Oh,
And I'm like,
nice.
wow, that's cool to see that transition.
Yeah, that's I don't know, man. I think there's something really interesting. We have a friend that he's a licensed therapist. He used to run a comic book shop in the UK, and I think they went out of business, and he was looking to do something what he wanted to do next. But basically he's dealing with people with PTSD, and he
Oh
took
man,
he took his training, and he uses tabletop role playing games to help people through PTSD, and it's very effective, which is really interesting.
that's
Like
great.
I think to me that's why I love. I played role playing games with my daughter. She's 9, and there's just something about shared story that really brings us together. That's why to me it's this whole thing about campfire stories bringing people together. That was one of the things that Shannon and my wife we talked about early on was like, how do we get people that energy of people sitting together and telling stories together? Like, how do we facilitate that? How do we make that happen? And because we've been playing tabletop role playing games together for years, and it's really so many good memories. And Yeah, I just think there's a certain magic in something that invites people together to tell those stories together. And I think you too, Chris, like you've got such an amazing career as a storyteller in some of the most pivotal games in the industry. And um, I don't know, do you ever reflect on kind of the impact you've had in the industry? Is that something you probably don't think about that? You're too modest.
It's no, it mostly feels like I'm going from one trip and fall and mistake to another. Because like I'm sure you've been in the same boat where like you do something and you're really glad that people are enjoying it, but all you see are the stuff that's missing or things that you did wrong.
Right.
And you're like,
Yeah.
oh, you know what? I should have like done X, Y, and Z. And then like, but the next time, like there's a new X, Y, and Z. So like it's most of like a continuing series of like, okay, well, I learned from that. And here's what I learned. And I
Yeah.
think I can take this and make it better in the next version. But it's hard to be completely satisfied with what you're doing. But as long as people are enjoying it, I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm curious if you could do any game right now. You don't have to tell, you don't have to spoil if you have something that you're working on, but if you could do anything, like what kind of game would you want to make if it was you and a couple buddies? Like what would be that game? What kind of genre? What kind of story? What would you do?
It would be superheroes.
Okay.
It would also be to depend on the development team because one thing that I enjoy, this isn't a big thing about superhero movies in general, but like what I really liked about a very low key superhero TV series called Alphas was they made sure that every superhero had a pretty crippling disadvantage.
Hmm.
Or like, hey, the woman who has the extrasensory like super high perceptions, like she can't stand being around people, especially if they're wearing Axe body spray. Like, you know, intimacy is literally painful for her, so she avoids like all this stuff that like you wouldn't normally consider with
Right.
superheroes. And then like, you know, the super strong guy didn't have the skeleton to actually be able to support things he would lift. So all he could do was punch. But then also he had high blood pressure and he had to be worried about his heart giving out during a fight. And like all this stuff that was just really interesting because it kept it more grounded. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a fun way to do superheroes that I think would be entertaining and not and you know and might be something fun to explore. But the
Yeah.
problem with superhero ego power fantasy is people don't want vulnerabilities. They don't want those disadvantages all the time. Like they do want to fly about Superman,
Yeah.
and then they work kryptonite every once in a while. But really, like so that's the kind of game that I think I would enjoy doing. But there's a whole bunch I'd really like to do.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel I'm so interested in the indie space right now that there's so many really cool
Yeah,
like experimental projects coming out that I'm really excited for what's coming up in games. I know a lot of people are, I mean, it's tough. The industry's tough right now, but I really feel like it's an exciting time for maybe this is the kick people need to go. I'm gonna take a shot on myself, and I don't know. I think it's exciting.
yeah, Curtis, you're right on because like with digital distribution, the small teams' ability to get their games to market without having necessarily go through a publisher, that has been so big about just creating more creativity and trying out new ideas in the industry. Like and you've worked for really big companies
Yeah,
and like they're really obviously risk adverse and I cannot blame them for that. Like they're putting millions upon millions of dollars on the line
yeah,
like for the Assassin's Creed 20. Like I get it. Like at the same time in the indie space where like the risks are, you know, they're still there, but like they're not as catastrophic. So being able to see the indie space, like, you know, try out 200 different ideas or a
yeah.
variation of something that gives me hope for the future. And it's really cool to sort of see that test bed of ideas as well as in the modding community too.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's a time of like I keep saying it's like a time of the renegades, the people that are gonna take a shot and do something weird and wild that no one's expecting that might change the industry. I think it's an exciting time. We have gone to the hour. Holy crap! That was quick. That went really quickly. I haven't checked. There is conversation, but I don't see any questions on the chat. But lots of comments that they're finding what you're saying really interesting. I did too, Chris. It's been really awesome to, well, first of all, meet you. It was randomly on LinkedIn. I think I reached out to you. I was just like, oh, maybe I'll respond to me. And I'm so glad you did, because I think, it's been really great getting to know you. And, I really feel like we've got a friendship growing. And I hope this is just kind of the first conversation amongst many.
Very simpatico, Curtis. I'm really glad that you reached out. And so I can express my fandom for Rat Queens.
Yeah, it was meant to be, man. It was meant to be for us to connect. But all right, man. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate the time you've given us. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Awesome. Thanks, man.